Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the stories that time forgot and darkness tried to bury. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most baffling mysteries in modern history. A case so inexplicable that it challenges everything we think we know about reality itself. This is the story of Millbrook Valley, a quiet farming community where on one ordinary Tuesday night, every single resident simply vanished without a trace. Before we begin, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear isn't just another missing persons case. This is something far more disturbing. Something that will make you question the very fabric of our world. So settle in, lock your doors, and prepare yourself for a journey into the impossible. Picture this. It's October 15th, 1987. Millbrook Valley, population 847, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Montana. A place where everyone knew everyone, where front doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual Harvest Festival. The kind of town that Norman Rockwell would have painted, where children rode bicycles until street lights came on and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar without thinking twice. But on the morning of October 16th, something was terrifyingly wrong. State Trooper Daniel Morrison was making his routine patrol along Highway 42 when he decided to stop at Betty's Diner for his usual coffee and pie. Betty Henderson had been serving the best apple pie in 3 counties for over 20 years, and her diner was the unofficial heart of Millbrook Valley. But when Morrison pulled into the parking lot, he noticed something odd. The diner's neon sign was still flickering. The door was propped open with its usual wooden wedge, and coffee was still brewing behind the counter. But Betty was nowhere to be found. Morrison called out, thinking perhaps she'd stepped into the back room. No response. He walked behind the counter, something he'd never done in 15 years of stopping there, and found a half-eaten piece of toast on a plate still warm. The coffee pot was nearly overflowing, as if someone had started brewing it and simply walked away mid-process. That's when Morrison noticed the silence. Not just the absence of Betty's usual cheerful chatter, but something deeper. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, that makes you realize something is fundamentally wrong with the world around you. He stepped outside and looked down Main Street. Every storefront was lit up, doors were open for business, but the street was completely empty. No cars moving, no people walking, no children playing. Just an eerie stillness that seemed to press against him from all sides. Morrison's first thought was that perhaps there had been an evacuation. A gas leak, maybe, or some kind of emergency that had required everyone to leave quickly. But there were no emergency vehicles, no signs of panic or hurried departure. Cars were parked neatly in driveways, bicycles leaned against porch railings, and laundry hung motionless on backyard clotheslines. He radioed for backup and began a systematic search of the town. What he found defied all logic and reason. At the elementary school, 23 desks still had pencils in children's hands, as if the students had been writing and simply stopped mid-sentence. Lunch trays sat half-eaten in the cafeteria, milk still cold in cartoon containers. The playground swings moved gently in the breeze, but no children's laughter echoed across the empty yard. The post office had mail sorted and ready for delivery, with postal worker Jim Crawford's coffee mug still warm on his desk. His mail truck was loaded and ready to go, keys still in the ignition, but Jim was gone. At Miller's hardware store, the cash register drawer was open with bills and coins scattered across the counter, as if someone had been making change when they suddenly disappeared. A customer's check lay partially written on the counter, the pen still uncapped beside it. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery was at the Millbrook Valley Fire Station. Fire Chief Robert Nash had apparently been in the middle of equipment maintenance when whatever happened occurred. Tools were laid out in perfect order. A fire hose was partially unrolled and his clipboard with inspection notes lay open, his handwriting stopping abruptly in the middle of a word. By evening, when backup arrived from the state police, they had searched every building, every home, every barn and shed in Millbrook Valley. 847 people had simply vanished, not just the people but their pets too. Dogs, cats, horses, cattle, even the goldfish in the elementary school classroom were gone. The only living things left in the entire town were wild animals and insects. Detective Sarah Chen, who would eventually lead the investigation, described the scene as surreal. It was like stepping into a movie set, she said. Everything looked normal, lived in, but completely devoid of life. Dinner tables were set for meals that would never be eaten. Television programs played to empty living rooms. Bathtubs were still full of warm water, as if people had simply evaporated mid-bath. The investigation that followed was unlike anything law enforcement had ever encountered. The FBI was called in within 48 hours. Followed by specialists from various government agencies whose names were never officially disclosed. They cordoned off the entire valley, establishing a perimeter that kept curious onlookers and media at bay. What they found challenged every conventional explanation. There were no signs of struggle anywhere in the town, no evidence of violence, no indication of panic or hurried departure. Personal belongings remained untouched. Wallets full of cash sat on nightstands, jewelry boxes remained locked, and family photographs smiled down from mantels at empty rooms. Cars were found in various states of operation. Some were parked normally, others were found running with doors open, as if the drivers had simply stepped out mid-journey and never returned. One vehicle was discovered at the intersection of Main Street and Elm Avenue, engine still running, turn signal blinking, radio playing a country song to an empty cab. The phone company record showed that several calls were in progress when the disappearances occurred. Operators reported that mid-conversation, the lines simply went dead. Not the sound of phones being hung up, but an abrupt silence, as if the people speaking had simply ceased to exist. Weather records from that night showed nothing unusual. No storms, no atmospheric anomalies, no seismic activity. October 15th had been a perfectly ordinary autumn evening with clear skies and mild temperatures. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. The investigation revealed that the disappearances hadn't happened all at once. Based on the evidence, people had been vanishing throughout the evening at different times. The earliest disappearance appeared to have occurred around 6:30 p.m. when Martha Sullivan was apparently in the middle of preparing dinner. Her stove was still on, vegetables were half chopped on the cutting board, and the oven timer was still counting down when investigators arrived. The latest disappearance seemed to have happened around 11:45 p.m., when night security guard Tom Bradley was making his rounds at the grain elevator. His flashlight was found on the ground still shining, and his clipboard showed he had checked off locations right up until he vanished. This staggered timeline suggested something even more disturbing than a mass disappearance. It implied that whatever was happening in Millbrook Valley was methodical, systematic, almost selective in nature. The FBI brought in psychologists, anthropologists, and specialists in cult behavior, theorizing that perhaps the entire town had been involved in some kind of mass suicide or religious event. But there was no evidence of any such organization or belief system in Millbrook Valley. The residents had been ordinary people living ordinary lives with no indication of extremist beliefs or unusual practices. Investigators interviewed family members and friends from neighboring towns, painting a picture of a completely normal community. The Hendersons had been planning their daughter's wedding for the following spring. The Millers had just taken out a loan to expand their hardware store. Children had homework assignments due the next day, and the high school football team was scheduled to play their homecoming game that Friday. These were not people preparing to disappear from the world. They were people deeply embedded in life, with plans and obligations and dreams that extended far beyond that October evening. Dr. Margaret Foster, a forensic psychologist who arrived with the federal team, spent weeks analyzing the personal effects left behind. She found appointment books filled with future plans, love letters between spouses discussing retirement dreams, and children's artwork hanging on refrigerators depicting family vacations that would never happen. The evidence painted a picture of people who had every intention of continuing their lives beyond that night. But the strangest discovery came from the town's only veterinarian, Dr. Richard Hayes. His office contained detailed medical records for every animal in Millbrook Valley. Dogs were scheduled for routine checkups, cats were due for vaccinations, and prize cattle had breeding appointments marked on calendars months in advance. Yet every single animal had vanished alongside their human companions. This detail troubled investigators more than they initially realized. Mass disappearances, while rare, had historical precedent. Religious cults, environmental disasters, even government relocations could theoretically account for humans vanishing. But the simultaneous disappearance of every domestic animal suggested something far more comprehensive, something that didn't discriminate between species. The investigation expanded to examine the town's infrastructure and utilities. The water treatment plant was found running normally, but the operator, James Mitchell, was gone. His logbook showed routine readings taken every hour until 9:15 p.m., when the entries simply stopped. The water continued flowing, the systems continued functioning, but the human element had been completely removed. At the telephone exchange, operators from the neighboring county reported that all lines to Millbrook Valley had gone silent simultaneously at different points throughout the evening. The last recorded incoming call was at 11:52 p.m. from a traveling salesman trying to confirm his morning appointment with the hardware store. The phone rang and rang, but no one ever answered. Local power company records showed electricity consumption dropping gradually throughout the evening. Not in the sudden spike or drop that might indicate an emergency, but in the slow, steady decline that would occur if appliances were simply left running as people vanished one by one. 3 weeks into the investigation, Agent Patricia Williams made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the federal team. While examining the town hall, she found the visitor registry book that all outsiders were required to sign. The last entry was dated October 15th, 3:47 p.m. A pharmaceutical sales representative named David Carver had signed in to meet with Dr. Patricia Woods, the town's only physician. The team immediately tracked down Carver's travel records. His rental car was found in Dr. Woods' parking lot, keys still in his jacket pocket, briefcase open on the passenger seat, with product samples arranged as if for a presentation. David Carver, a resident of Denver with no connection to Millbrook Valley beyond his business appointment, had vanished along with everyone else. This revelation forced investigators to reconsider their theories. Whatever had happened wasn't limited to long-term residents. It wasn't about family connections or community ties. Simply being present in Millbrook Valley that evening had been enough to ensure disappearance. The timeline became crucial. Phone records and witness statements from surrounding areas helped investigators piece together a more precise chronology. The disappearances had begun at the outskirts of town and moved inward, like a wave slowly consuming everything in its path. Rural farmhouses on the valley's edges had emptied first, followed by residential neighborhoods, and finally the downtown business district. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, who lived 15 miles away, reported that she had spoken with her sister Ruth at 6:45 p.m. Ruth lived on Maple Street in Millbrook Valley and had called to confirm dinner plans for the weekend. The conversation had been completely normal, Eleanor insisted. Ruth had mentioned that her husband was watching television, and that she was about to start preparing dinner. There had been no indication of anything unusual happening, but when investigators checked Ruth's kitchen, they found the phone receiver lying on the counter beside a cookbook open to a recipe for pot roast. The stove was cold, no food had been prepared, and Ruth and her husband were nowhere to be found. Similar accounts came from relatives and friends in neighboring communities. Normal conversations that ended abruptly, not with goodbyes or indications of emergency, but with sudden silence, as if the speakers had simply stopped existing mid-sentence. The investigation took another disturbing turn when satellite imagery from that evening was analyzed. Weather monitoring satellites had captured infrared images of Millbrook Valley throughout the night of October 15th. The images showed heat signatures consistent with normal human activity until approximately 6:30 p.m. After that, the heat signatures began disappearing in a pattern that matched the investigators' timeline. By midnight, the thermal images showed empty buildings cooling gradually, vehicles with engines running but no human heat signatures inside, and a landscape devoid of the warm spots that indicated human presence. It was as if the town had been systematically drained of all life over the course of 5.5 hours. Military analysts studying the imagery noted something that chilled everyone involved in the investigation. The disappearances followed no natural pattern. They weren't random, and they weren't based on proximity to any central point. Instead, they seemed to follow the town's infrastructure, following power lines, water mains, and telephone cables, as if something was using the utility networks to navigate through the community. Dr. Amanda Sterling, a specialist in atmospheric phenomena, was brought in to examine weather data from that evening. Her analysis revealed subtle anomalies that had been missed in the initial review. Barometric pressure had fluctuated in strange ways throughout the evening, rising and falling in patterns that didn't match any known weather system. More troubling were the electromagnetic readings. Sensitive equipment in the region had recorded unusual magnetic field variations beginning around 6 p.m. and continuing until just after midnight. The fluctuations were too regular to be natural, too complex to be explained by solar activity, and too localized to be attributed to any known phenomenon. Radio communications in the area had also experienced interference during those crucial hours. Ham radio operators in neighboring counties reported strange static, and what some described as whispers or voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. When recordings of these transmissions were analyzed by linguistic experts, they found patterns that resembled human speech but contained elements that didn't match any known language structure. The psychological profiles of Millbrook Valley's residents revealed no common thread that might explain their collective disappearance. They represented a cross-section of rural American life: farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and retirees, young families and elderly couples. Their political affiliations varied. Their religious beliefs spanned multiple denominations, and their personal histories showed no connections to unusual organizations or activities. Dr. Foster's team conducted extensive interviews with family members from outside the valley, searching for any indication that the residents had been planning something together. But the evidence consistently pointed to people living normal lives with normal concerns and normal plans for the future. The children's schoolwork provided particularly poignant evidence of lives interrupted rather than lives planned for ending. Homework assignments were half completed. Art projects sat unfinished on desks, and permission slips for upcoming field trips lay unsigned on kitchen counters. These were not the belongings of people preparing for departure. As the investigation stretched into its second month, federal resources began to dwindle. The case was classified at the highest levels of government, with access restricted to personnel with specialized clearances. Official statements to the media were carefully crafted to provide minimal information while discouraging further inquiry. But despite the growing wall of secrecy surrounding Millbrook Valley, one fact remained undeniably clear. 847 people, along with all their animals, had vanished from the face of the earth in the span of a few hours, leaving behind a perfectly preserved snapshot of interrupted lives and unanswered questions that would haunt investigators for decades to come. The media blackout that followed was swift and absolute. Within days of the federal agencies establishing their perimeter, all local news coverage ceased. National networks were given carefully scripted statements about an ongoing investigation into environmental hazards, and journalists who pressed for more information found their credentials revoked and their access denied. But information has a way of seeping out, even from the most tightly controlled situations. Over the following months, fragments of the investigation began to surface through unofficial channels. Former military personnel, Retired federal agents and academic researchers who had been peripherally involved started sharing details that painted an even more disturbing picture of what investigators had discovered in Millbrook Valley. According to these leaked accounts, the physical evidence found in the town went far beyond the initial reports of interrupted daily activities. Hidden in classified files were photographs and documentation of anomalies that defied scientific explanation. Investigators had discovered patterns in the arrangement of abandoned objects that suggested some form of organized activity had taken place before or during the disappearances. Dr. Robert Hendricks, a physicist who claimed to have been part of the early investigative team, spoke anonymously to researchers decades later. He described finding electromagnetic residue throughout the town that indicated exposure to energy sources unknown to conventional science. Electronic devices had been affected in ways that suggested they had been subjected to forces that shouldn't exist according to established physical laws. More disturbing were his accounts of temporal anomalies discovered during the investigation. Clocks throughout Millbrook Valley had stopped at different times, but not in any pattern that corresponded to when the disappearances occurred. Some timepieces had stopped days before October 15th, while others continued running for weeks after power to the buildings had been cut off. Digital displays showed impossible dates, and mechanical watches were found running backwards. The town's library provided another piece of the puzzle that investigators struggled to understand. Books had been removed from shelves throughout the building, not randomly, but according to a specific system that librarians from neighboring towns couldn't decipher. Volumes on astronomy, geology, and theoretical physics were missing, along with historical texts focusing on unexplained disappearances and folklore about missing civilizations. But the books weren't simply missing. They had been arranged on tables throughout the library in complex patterns that resembled mathematical equations when viewed from above. Photographs of these arrangements were analyzed by specialists in multiple fields, but no one could determine what they were meant to represent or calculate. The elementary school provided equally confusing evidence. Children's artwork had been removed from bulletin boards and rearranged on classroom floors to create large-scale images that were only recognizable when viewed from significant height. These images depicted star patterns, geographic formations, and symbols that didn't correspond to anything in the standard curriculum. Teachers from nearby schools who were shown photographs of these arrangements insisted that the complexity of the patterns was far beyond what elementary students could create. The precision of the geometric relationships and the sophisticated understanding of spatial concepts required suggested adult intervention. Yet there was no evidence that any adults had been in the school after normal hours. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery made in the town's cemetery. Every headstone dating back more than 50 years had been cleaned and polished, with fresh flowers placed at each grave. The maintenance required for such an undertaking would have taken dozens of people working for days. Yet groundskeeper William Torres had vanished along with everyone else, and no one from outside the community had reported seeing unusual activity in the cemetery. The flowers themselves presented another mystery. They were species that didn't grow naturally in Montana, and local florists confirmed that no one had ordered such arrangements. Botanical analysis revealed that some of the flowers were varieties that had been extinct for decades, somehow preserved in perfect condition and placed with mathematical precision according to the dates on the graves. Underground, investigators found something even more perplexing. The town's utility tunnels, which housed water pipes and electrical conduits, showed evidence of recent excavation. New chambers had been carved into the bedrock beneath Millbrook Valley, connected by passages that formed intricate geometric patterns when mapped from above. These underground modifications would have required months of work by skilled engineers and construction crews, yet no permits had been filed, no equipment had been rented, and no one in the surrounding area had noticed the massive undertaking such construction would have required. The precision of the work suggested advanced drilling techniques, but the tool marks on the stone walls were unlike anything produced by conventional excavation equipment. Inside these chambers, investigators discovered installations that defied identification. Metallic structures that seemed to grow from the rock itself, arranged in configurations that suggested some form of technological purpose, but operated according to principles that didn't match any known engineering standards. Dr. Sarah Chen, years later, would describe these discoveries as the most troubling aspect of the entire investigation. The evidence suggested that whatever had happened in Millbrook Valley hadn't been spontaneous. The underground modifications, the rearranged books and artwork, the cleaned cemetery, all pointed to extensive preparation that must have taken place over months or even years. But how could such massive undertakings have occurred without anyone noticing? Millbrook Valley was a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Major construction projects, unusual nighttime activity, or the sudden appearance of non-native flowers would have been topics of conversation for weeks. The investigation team brought in specialists in hypnosis and recovered memory techniques to interview residents from neighboring towns. The sessions revealed fragments of suppressed memories that were even more disturbing than the physical evidence. Multiple witnesses, when placed under hypnosis, recalled seeing lights in Millbrook Valley on nights preceding the disappearance. Not ordinary lights, but luminous phenomena that moved through the town in organized patterns, visiting each building systematically. Under hypnosis, witnesses described feeling compelled to avoid looking directly at these lights, as if some instinct warned them that observation would be dangerous. Others recalled hearing sounds from the direction of the valley on multiple occasions throughout the summer and early fall of 1987. Mechanical noises that didn't correspond to any known machinery, rhythmic patterns that suggested coordinated activity, and what some described as voices speaking in unison, though the words were never clear enough to understand. Most disturbing were the accounts of people who claimed to have visited Millbrook Valley in the weeks before the disappearance and found the residents behaving strangely. Under hypnosis, these witnesses described interactions with townspeople who seemed somehow different, as if they were performing their normal routines rather than living them naturally. a traveling salesman who had made regular stops in Millbrook Valley for over a decade, described conversations with longtime acquaintances who seemed to have forgotten personal details they should have remembered. Shopkeepers couldn't recall his usual orders. Neighbors failed to ask about his family, and even Betty Henderson at the diner served him coffee without the friendly banter that had characterized their interactions for years. These memories had been suppressed, the witnesses claimed, because acknowledging the strangeness would have required confronting the possibility that something fundamental had changed in a place they thought they knew well. It was easier to dismiss the odd interactions as imagination or distraction than to consider that the people of Millbrook Valley were no longer quite themselves. The hypnosis sessions also revealed that the disappearance itself had been preceded by unusual electromagnetic phenomena that extended far beyond the valley. Radio and television reception had been disrupted throughout the region for weeks, with signals fading in and out according to no discernible pattern. Farmers reported that their animals had been behaving strangely, refusing to graze in fields with clear sight lines to Millbrook Valley, and gathering in barns and shelters even during pleasant weather. Livestock that had previously been docile became agitated when taken too close to the valley's borders, and several ranchers reported cattle breaking through fences to avoid areas where they had previously grazed contentedly. These behavioral changes had been so gradual and seemingly unrelated that no one had connected them to events in Millbrook Valley until the hypnosis sessions brought the memories to the surface. In retrospect, the entire region had been experiencing anomalies for months before the mass disappearance, but the human mind's tendency to normalize unusual experiences had prevented anyone from recognizing the pattern. The investigation's classified findings, according to leaked documents that surfaced years later, included evidence that suggested the disappearances were not an isolated incident. Similar patterns of electromagnetic disturbance, animal behavior changes, and subtle alterations in human interaction had been documented in other remote communities across the United States over the previous decade. These earlier cases had been dismissed as local phenomena or investigated by different agencies without coordination. But when analyzed together, they revealed a progression of increasingly sophisticated activities leading up to the events in Millbrook Valley. It was as if something had been practicing, refining its methods through smaller-scale operations before attempting something as ambitious as the complete evacuation of an entire town. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If Millbrook Valley represented the culmination of a series of experiments or operations, then the disappearance of 847 people was not an end, but a beginning. Whatever force or intelligence was responsible had demonstrated the capability to remove entire populations without leaving conventional evidence, and the systematic nature of the preparatory work suggested that more such events might be planned for the future. This possibility prompted a shift in how the remaining investigators approached the case. What had begun as a missing persons investigation transformed into something far more complex. A study of coordinated activities that spanned years and potentially multiple locations. The scope of the operation suggested resources and planning capabilities that exceeded anything attributed to conventional criminal organizations or government agencies. Dr. Chen's team began examining historical records from across the American West, searching for communities that had experienced similar preparatory phenomena. What they discovered was a trail of subtle anomalies stretching back nearly 2 decades, each incident building upon lessons learned from previous operations. In 1969, the mining town of Silver Creek, Colorado, had experienced a 3-day period where every resident reported the same recurring dream. People described visions of their town empty, with all familiar sounds replaced by a low humming that seemed to emanate from beneath the earth. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that the local newspaper ran a feature story about the phenomenon, but nothing unusual followed and the incident was forgotten. 5 years later, the farming community of Wheat Ridge, Kansas, documented a week-long period where all electronic devices malfunctioned simultaneously each evening at sunset. Radios produced static, televisions displayed geometric patterns instead of programs, and telephone conversations were interrupted by what operators described as mathematical sequences spoken in monotone voices. Again, the anomalies ceased as abruptly as they had begun, leaving no lasting effects except detailed records in the telephone company's maintenance logs. By 1978, the patterns had become more sophisticated. In Riverside Falls, Oregon, residents reported a gradual change in the behavior of local wildlife. Animals that had lived harmoniously in the area for generations began forming unusual social groupings, with predators and prey gathering in the same locations without conflict. The phenomenon lasted 6 months before wildlife patterns returned to normal. But during that period, naturalists documented behaviors that challenged established understanding of animal instincts. Each incident, when examined individually, appeared to be an isolated curiosity. Local explanations ranged from solar flare activity to underground gas deposits to mass psychological phenomena. But when viewed as a progression, they revealed an intelligence systematically testing different approaches to environmental manipulation, gathering data about human and animal responses to increasingly complex interventions. The Millbrook Valley disappearance represented the successful implementation of techniques refined through years of smaller experiments. Whatever intelligence was responsible had learned to coordinate electromagnetic manipulation, behavioral modification, and physical construction projects while remaining undetected by local populations until the final implementation phase. But the most chilling discovery came from analyzing satellite imagery of other communities that had experienced preparatory phenomena. Using advanced enhancement techniques unavailable during the original investigations, analysts found evidence of underground construction in every location where anomalies had been reported. The excavation patterns were identical to those discovered beneath Millbrook Valley, suggesting that similar installations had been built and then apparently abandoned after each testing phase. These findings raised terrifying questions about the scope of the operation. How many communities across the country contained hidden installations left behind from previous experiments? Were these sites dormant, or did they serve ongoing purposes that investigators had failed to identify? And most disturbing of all were their communities currently undergoing preparatory phases for future disappearances. The investigation officially concluded in the spring of 1988 with a classified report that was never released to the public. The town of Millbrook Valley was declared a permanent environmental hazard zone, and access was restricted indefinitely. The families of the disappeared were provided with death certificates and financial compensation, but were required to sign agreements preventing them from discussing the case publicly. Over the following decades, the site was gradually reclaimed by nature. Buildings collapsed, vegetation overgrew the streets, and the physical evidence of the community slowly disappeared. But the underground installations remained intact, their purpose and creators still unknown to this day. Occasionally, hikers or hunters report strange lights moving through the overgrown ruins of Millbrook Valley. Electromagnetic equipment malfunctions when brought too close to the site, and animals continue to avoid the area despite the absence of any apparent threats. Local authorities maintain the environmental hazard designation and quickly remove anyone found trespassing in the restricted zone. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Millbrook Valley case isn't what happened to those 847 people, but what their disappearance might represent for the rest of us. If an entire community can be systematically prepared for removal over months or years without anyone noticing the signs, how would we recognize if our own communities were being similarly evaluated? The behavioral changes, the subtle infrastructure modifications, the gradual alterations in routine interactions that were documented in Millbrook Valley could be occurring anywhere. The human mind's tendency to normalize unusual experiences means that we might dismiss early warning signs just as the residents of surrounding communities had dismissed the strange phenomena they witnessed in 1987. Tonight, as you return to your own community, consider the small details that make up your daily life. The familiar sounds, the predictable routines, the comforting presence of neighbors going about their business. Now imagine if those details began changing slowly, subtly, in ways that seemed insignificant at first but gradually accumulated into something fundamentally different. Would you notice? Would you investigate? Or would you, like the witnesses who required hypnosis to recover their suppressed memories, find it easier to dismiss the strangeness rather than confront the possibility that forces beyond your understanding were reshaping the world around you? The residents of Millbrook Valley never got the chance to answer those questions. On that October evening in 1987, they simply stepped out of existence, leaving behind only the echo of interrupted lives and the terrifying knowledge that somewhere in our world, an intelligence with capabilities beyond our comprehension continues to operate according to its own incomprehensible agenda. 847 people learned too late that the ordinary world they thought they knew was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. The question that haunts investigators to this day is simple but terrible. How many more communities are currently being prepared for the same fate? And will we recognize the signs in time to prevent the next Millbrook Valley from vanishing into the darkness forever? This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never see coming. And the most dangerous secrets are the ones hiding in plain sight. Sleep well. and perhaps tomorrow take a closer look at your neighbors. Make sure they're still exactly who they used to be.